The cathedral stood like a monument to wealth and power, its Gothic spires piercing the gray September sky. Inside, Manhattan's elite gathered in their finest black attire, their whispers echoing off marble columns as they mourned Victoria Stone, the billionaire tech mogul who had revolutionized the artificial intelligence industry. At 62, her death from a sudden heart attack had sent shockwaves through Wall Street and Silicon Valley alike. The mahogany casket, adorned with white roses that cost more than most people's annual salary, rested at the altar beneath stained glass windows that cast rainbow shadows across the mourners' solemn faces. Victoria's son, Marcus, sat in the front pew, his jaw clenched tight as he stared at the closed casket. He'd barely shed a tear since receiving the news 3 days ago. Their relationship had been complicated. She'd been more CEO than mother, more investor than parent. Now, as the priest droned on about her charitable contributions and business acumen, Marcus felt nothing but emptiness. Behind him, board members and competitors alike had come to pay their respects, though he suspected many were simply there to ensure she was truly gone. Victoria Stone had made as many enemies as she had fortunes. Outside the cathedral, Thomas McCarthy huddled against the cold stone wall, his weathered hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee he'd fished from a trash can. The 60-year-old homeless man had called these streets home for the past 5 years, ever since his construction business collapsed and took his marriage with it. He watched the parade of limousines with detached curiosity, another world he'd once briefly touched now forever out of reach. But something drew him toward the massive oak doors, a feeling he couldn't quite name, a pull in his chest that made his heart race. Thomas had learned to trust his instincts on the streets. They'd kept him alive through brutal winters and dangerous nights. Now those same instincts screamed at him that something was desperately wrong. He shuffled closer to the entrance, ignoring the security guard's suspicious glares. Through the crack in the door, he could see the casket, the flowers, the grieving crowd. The priest was building toward the final blessing, the moment when Victoria Stone would be sealed away forever. That's when Thomas saw it, the almost imperceptible movement of the casket lid, a slight tremor that made the roses shiver. His breath caught in his throat. He'd seen death up close on the streets. He knew the stillness of it, the absolute finality. What he was witnessing now was something else entirely. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, Thomas pushed through the cathedral doors. His ragged coat and unkempt beard drew immediate gasps from the assembled mourners. Security moved toward him, but he was already running down the aisle, his worn boots echoing like gunshots in the sacred space. "Stop," he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "She's not dead. For God's sake, she's not dead." Chaos erupted in the cathedral as Thomas reached the altar, his outstretched hand pointing at the casket with trembling conviction. Security guards converged on him from 3 directions, their hands reaching for his arms, ready to drag the madman away from this sacred moment. The priest stepped back in shock, his prayer book falling to the marble floor with a sharp crack that seemed to freeze everyone in place. Marcus Stone leaped from his pew, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. This was exactly the kind of spectacle his mother would have hated, a public disruption, a loss of control, a moment of vulnerability exposed for all to see. "Get him out of here," Marcus shouted, his voice bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. But Thomas stood his ground, even as hands gripped his shoulders. "I saw her move. I swear on my life, I saw movement in that casket." His words tumbled out desperately, each syllable fighting against the disbelief etched on every face in the room. The security guards began hauling him backward, his feet scraping against the polished floor, but his eyes never left the casket. "Please, you have to check. What if I'm right? What if she's alive in there?" Dr. Helen Rodriguez, Victoria's personal physician, stood among the mourners, her professional instincts suddenly overriding social propriety. She'd signed the death certificate herself after examining Victoria in her penthouse 3 days ago. The woman had been cold, pulseless, showing every sign of cardiac arrest. But something in Thomas's voice, the raw certainty, the desperate conviction, made her pause. She'd heard of cases, rare but documented, of catalepsy, of comas so deep they mimicked death. The wealthy often received quick cremations or burials, their families too grief-stricken to wait, too powerful to be questioned. "Wait!" Dr. Rodriguez called out, her voice cutting through the commotion. She stepped forward, her heels clicking purposefully against the floor.
"Wait.
Let me examine her." Marcus wheeled on her, his face flushed. "Helen, you pronounced her dead. You signed the papers. This is insane." But the doctor was already at the casket, her fingers finding the latches. The security guards released Thomas, uncertainty replacing their aggression. The homeless man stumbled forward, breathing hard, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and fear and something deeper, the knowledge that he'd just crossed a line from which there was no return. Dr. Rodriguez opened the casket, and a collective gasp swept through the cathedral. Victoria Stone lay perfectly still, her silver hair arranged elegantly around her face, her hands folded across her chest. She wore a navy blue dress, her signature color, and diamond earrings that caught the light. To everyone watching, she looked exactly as a dead woman should, peaceful, absent, gone. But the doctor's trained hands moved to Victoria's neck, feeling for a pulse, and her eyes widened. "She's warm," Dr. Rodriguez whispered, her voice barely audible. Then louder, urgent. "She's warm. Her skin is too warm for someone who's been dead for 3 days." She pressed her fingers harder against Victoria's carotid artery, counting seconds that felt like hours. Then she felt it. Faint, irregular, but undeniable. A pulse. "Oh my God," the doctor breathed. "Call 911.
Now."
"She's alive." The ambulance sirens wailed through Manhattan streets as paramedics worked frantically over Victoria Stone's body. Inside the cathedral, what had been a funeral transformed into an emergency medical scene, with Dr. Rodriguez barking orders while Victoria was lifted onto a gurney. Thomas stood frozen against a column, hardly believing what he'd just witnessed, what he'd somehow known. His intervention had saved a life, pulled a woman back from a premature grave. The security guards who'd tried to remove him now stood back, shamefaced and silent, while Marcus Stone sat in his pew looking shell-shocked, his entire world turned upside down in a matter of minutes. At Mount Sinai Hospital, Victoria was rushed into intensive care. Doctors discovered she'd been in a rare state called locked-in syndrome, caused by a combination of an adverse reaction to her blood pressure medication and an undiagnosed neurological condition. Her body had shut down almost completely, but her consciousness had remained trapped inside, aware but unable to communicate. For 3 days, she'd lain in that casket in the funeral home, conscious but paralyzed, experiencing every moment of her own funeral arrangements with growing horror. She'd heard the embalmers discussing her body. She'd felt the cold of the preparation room. And she'd prayed, something she hadn't done since childhood, for a miracle. Thomas had been that miracle. As Victoria began to regain some movement under the doctor's care, Marcus found himself wandering the hospital corridors in a daze. He'd been prepared to bury his mother, to take over her company, to step into the role he'd been groomed for his entire life. Instead, she was alive, recovering, and he was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that he'd felt something like relief when he'd thought she was gone. The guilt of that realization sat like a stone in his chest. He found himself at the hospital's main entrance, watching the homeless people who congregated near the warmth of the building and thinking about the man who'd saved his mother's life. Meanwhile, hospital security had escorted Thomas out, telling him the family would be in touch, but clearly wanting him away from the wealthy patients and their visitors. He'd returned to his usual spot 3 blocks away, under an awning behind a Thai restaurant, his mind reeling. He'd saved a billionaire's life. The thought seemed absurd and impossible. Who was he to save anyone? He couldn't even save himself from the streets, couldn't save his business, couldn't save his marriage. Yet somehow, in that cathedral, he'd been exactly where he needed to be, had seen what no one else could see. Inside the ICU, as medications and treatment slowly restored her ability to move and speak, Victoria Stone's eyes flickered open with full consciousness for the first time in days. Her throat was raw from intubation, her body weak from immobility, but her mind was sharp and clear. The first words she croaked out to Dr. Rodriguez were, the homeless man who stopped the funeral. I heard his voice. I heard him save me. Where is he? The doctor exchanged glances with Marcus, who had finally been allowed into his mother's room. We sent him away, Marcus admitted quietly. No one thought to find him, Victoria interrupted, her voice gaining strength despite the oxygen mask. Find him and bring him to me. That man saved my life. I owe him everything. Find him. Now. Marcus Stone stood in his mother's hospital room, phone pressed to his ear as he mobilized resources with the efficiency that came from a lifetime of wealth and privilege. Private investigators, security firms, police contacts. Within an hour, he had a dozen people searching for one homeless man in a city of 8 million. But finding Thomas McCarthy proved more difficult than anyone anticipated. The streets had their own rules, their own invisibility. Homeless people moved like ghosts through the city, noticed only when someone wanted them gone, disappearing into shelters, subway stations, and hidden camps that existed in the blind spots of urban consciousness. Dr. Rodriguez visited Victoria every few hours, monitoring her remarkable recovery. The neurological condition that had caused the locked-in syndrome was treatable, though it would require ongoing medication and monitoring. You're lucky to be alive, the doctor told her during one examination. If that man hadn't stopped the funeral when he did, if we'd proceeded with the burial? She didn't need to finish the sentence. Victoria shuddered, the memory of lying conscious in that casket still vivid and terrifying. She'd heard every word of her eulogy, every sob and whisper. She'd felt the lid close over her face. And she'd screamed silently, unable to make her body obey her desperate commands. Tell me about him, Victoria said, her voice stronger now. The man who saved me. Marcus, who'd remained in the room, pulled up security footage from the cathedral on his tablet. Together, they watched Thomas's wild dash down the aisle, his desperate shouts, his absolute conviction despite the insanity of what he was claiming. He looks like he's lived rough for a while, Marcus observed. Probably mentally ill. Most of them are. Victoria shot her son a sharp look that reminded him exactly who had raised him. That man had the clarity to see what an entire cathedral full of supposedly sane, successful people missed. Don't ever call him mentally ill in my presence again. The rebuke stung, but Marcus knew his mother was right. He'd been raised to believe that success and wealth were measures of intelligence and worth. The homeless were failures, addicts, people who'd made bad choices. But this man, this Thomas McCarthy, as they'd learned from investigators who'd found witnesses near the cathedral, had saved his mother's life through sheer intuition and courage. What did that say about the values Marcus had been taught? What did it say about the way he'd been preparing to step into his mother's empire, perhaps a bit too eagerly? On the third day of the search, a private investigator named Sarah Chin tracked Thomas to a homeless services center in the Bronx. She found him in line for dinner, his coat wrapped tight against the October chill that had arrived while Victoria lay recovering. "Mr. McCarthy?" she asked, approaching cautiously. Thomas looked up, suspicion immediately clouding his weathered features. He'd learned that when people sought him out by name, it usually meant trouble, warrants, evictions, accusations. "I'm not looking for problems," he said defensively. Sarah raised her hands in a peaceful gesture. "No problems. I'm here because Victoria Stone wants to meet you. The woman whose funeral you stopped. She's awake, she's recovering, and she wants to thank the man who saved her life." Thomas sat in the back of a Lincoln Town car, feeling absurdly out of place against the leather seats. Sarah Chin had given him money for a haircut and new clothes, jeans, a button-down shirt, a warm jacket that didn't have holes in it. But beneath the clean exterior, Thomas still felt like the same broken man who'd been sleeping on sidewalks for 5 years. The city looked different from inside this car, filtered through tinted windows, the streets he'd walked 1,000 times now seeming like a different world entirely. As they pulled up to Mount Sinai's private entrance, his hands began to shake. Victoria Stone's private room looked more like a hotel suite than a hospital space. Flowers filled every surface, Get-well cards from presidents and celebrities covered a table, and the window offered a panoramic view of Central Park. But Thomas barely noticed any of it. His attention was fixed on the woman in the bed, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, studying him with an intensity that made him want to flee. "Mr. McCarthy," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Please sit down. You look terrified." He managed a weak laugh. "I'm not used to places like this, ma'am." "Neither was I once," Victoria replied, surprising him. "I grew up in a 3-room apartment in Queens with 5 siblings. My father was a janitor. My mother cleaned houses. I wore hand-me-downs and ate government cheese." She paused, letting that sink in. "I know what it's like to be invisible, Mr. McCarthy. I know what it's like to be dismissed, overlooked, treated as if you don't matter. I spent 40 years building an empire, so I'd never feel that way again. And then I died, or almost died, and discovered that all my wealth, all my power, meant nothing. I was as helpless as anyone." Thomas found himself drawn into her story, despite his discomfort. "What happened to you? I mean, how did you end up in that casket?" Victoria explained the medical details, the medication reaction, the locked-in syndrome, the series of failures that had led to her being pronounced dead prematurely. "I was conscious through all of it," she said quietly. "I felt them preparing my body. I heard my own eulogy. I experienced a horror that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy." Her eyes met his. "And then I heard your voice. You stopped them. You saved me when everyone else, doctors, family, friends, had already given up." "I just saw the casket move," Thomas said awkwardly. "I couldn't let them bury you without checking." Victoria leaned forward slightly. "No. You had the courage to act when action meant looking foolish, being thrown out, being dismissed as crazy. You had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and you did it anyway. That's not just seeing something, Mr. McCarthy. That's character. That's the kind of quality that money can't buy and success doesn't guarantee." She gestured to the chair closer to her bed. "Now I want to hear your story. How does a man end up on the streets? And please, don't spare the details. I've learned recently that we never know when our own story might end. I want to know yours." Thomas hesitated, and used to anyone caring about his history. But something in Victoria's direct gaze told him she genuinely wanted to know, that this wasn't polite charity, but real interest. So he began. "I owned a construction company, McCarthy and Sons, though I only had one son. We were doing well, not rich, but comfortable. 3 crews, steady contracts, a nice house in New Jersey. My wife, Maria, she managed the books. We were partners in everything." His voice grew softer, more painful. Then the recession hit. 2008, construction dried up overnight. He described the desperate months that followed, trying to keep the business alive by taking on debt, by mortgaging their house, by making promises he couldn't keep. "I started drinking," he admitted. "Not much at first, just to sleep, to quiet the anxiety. But it got worse. Maria begged me to declare bankruptcy, to start over, but I was too proud. I thought I could fix it." His hands clenched in his lap. "I couldn't fix it. We lost everything. The business, the house, our savings. Maria left me, took our son to her sister's place in Florida. I don't blame her. I was a mess." The drinking had escalated, Thomas explained, until he'd lost the ability to hold down even basic jobs. Friends had tried to help, but he'd pushed them away, too ashamed to accept charity, too broken to rebuild. "One day I just ended up on the streets. It happens faster than you think. Miss a few rent payments, get evicted, have no one to call. Suddenly you're carrying everything you own in a backpack, figuring out where to sleep without getting robbed or arrested." He looked up at Victoria. "I've been homeless for 5 years now. Most days, I'm invisible. People look right through me like I'm not there." Victoria listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed she was really hearing him, not just waiting for her turn to speak. She wanted to know about his son, Daniel, now 23, working as an electrician in Tampa. Thomas hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. "I call sometimes from payphones, but I hang up when he answers. What would I even say?" Hi, son. Dad's still a homeless drunk? The bitterness in his voice was palpable. I'm a cautionary tale. A reminder of what happens when you fail. Or, Victoria said carefully, you're a man who's been through hell and somehow retained enough humanity to save a stranger's life when it mattered most. Mr. McCarthy, I've known plenty of successful people who would have walked past that cathedral without a second thought.
Who would have assumed someone else would handle it.
Who wouldn't have cared enough to risk embarrassment. She paused. You want to know what I think? I think you've been punishing yourself for years for being human, for making mistakes, for not being perfect. And I think it's time for that to stop. Thomas looked up sharply. What do you mean? Victoria smiled, and for the first time since waking up, she looked like the formidable businesswoman who'd built a billion-dollar empire. I mean, I'm going to help you, Mr. McCarthy. Not out of charity, but because I believe you deserve a second chance. And because I've learned that second chances are more precious than all the money in the world. Victoria Stone's proposal was not what Thomas expected. He'd assumed she'd offer him money, perhaps a reward for saving her life, maybe enough for a few months in a cheap apartment. Instead, she offered him something far more valuable and terrifying: opportunity. I'm creating a new position in my company, she explained. Director of Second Chances. Your job will be to identify people who've fallen through society's cracks, people who've made mistakes, who've failed, who've been written off, and help them rebuild.
Thomas
Stared at her, convinced he'd misheard. Me? Work for your company? I don't have any qualifications. I've been homeless for 5 years. Exactly, Victoria said firmly. You have the one qualification that matters most. You understand what it's like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to need help but not know how to ask for it. I've donated millions to homeless charities over the years, Mr. McCarthy, but I've never really understood the problem. I've never lived it. You have. She pulled out a tablet and showed him plans for a new initiative, Stone Foundation Pathways. It would provide not just housing and job training, but comprehensive support, addiction counseling, medical care, legal help, family reunification services, everything someone needed to truly rebuild their life. But I'm not qualified to run something like that, Thomas protested, even as hope began flickering in his chest for the first time in years. Victoria waved away his concern. You'll have staff, advisors, experts in every field. Your job is to bring the perspective no one else can, the view from the streets, the understanding of what really helps versus what makes donors feel good. I need someone who'll tell me the truth, who won't sugarcoat the problems, who's been there. She leaned forward. But Thomas, I need to know something first. Can you get sober? Because if you're going to do this, you need to be clear-headed. I'll pay for the best treatment program in the country, but you have to do the work. The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd been drunk or hungover for so long that sobriety seemed like a distant dream, something other people achieved. I don't know, he answered honestly. I've tried before. It didn't stick. Victoria nodded, appreciating his honesty. Then try again. And this time, you'll have support, structure, a reason beyond survival. You'll have a purpose. She told him about her own struggles with prescription medication, how she'd nearly become addicted to pain pills after a back injury, how close she'd come to letting pills solve all her problems. Addiction doesn't discriminate, Thomas. Rich, poor, it finds us all in our weak moments. But recovery is possible. I've seen it happen. Marcus, who'd been listening from the corner of the room, finally spoke up. Mom, are you sure about this? No offense, Mr. McCarthy, but this is a huge responsibility. Millions of dollars are going to flow through this program. We need accountability, structure, experience. Victoria turned to her son with a look that reminded him she was still very much in charge. Marcus, every hire is a risk. Every investment is a gamble. I've built this company on seeing potential where others see problems. Mr. McCarthy saved my life because he paid attention when everyone else was looking away. That's the skill I need for this program. She turned back to Thomas. So, what do you say? Are you willing to try? Are you willing to get clean, to work hard, to help others who are where you've been? Thomas felt tears burning in his eyes, the first real tears he'd cried in years. Yes, he whispered. Yes, I'll try. I can't promise I'll succeed, but I'll try. Victoria smiled and extended her hand. When Thomas took it, he felt the firm grip of someone who'd climbed from poverty to billions, someone who understood that second chances were earned through sweat and determination and refusing to give up even when the world said you should. Then welcome to Stone Industries, Mr. McCarthy, Victoria said. Your life starts now. Again. The Silver Springs Recovery Center occupied 50 acres in upstate New York, a place where executives and celebrities went to quietly deal with their demons away from cameras and judgment. Thomas arrived 3 days after accepting Victoria's offer, his few belongings fitting in a single duffel bag that the Stone family had provided. As the car wound up the long driveway through autumn trees, he fought the urge to run, to return to the streets where at least he knew the rules, where failure was expected rather than something that would disappoint people who'd invested in him. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, the center's director, greeted him personally. Mr. McCarthy, welcome. Mrs. Stone called ahead. We're going to take good care of you here. The first week was brutal. Detoxification from alcohol after years of heavy drinking was physically agonizing: shakes, sweats, nausea, insomnia. But worse than the physical symptoms was the emotional reckoning. In group therapy sessions, Thomas was forced to confront the choices he'd made, the people he'd hurt, the life he'd thrown away. I was a coward, he admitted during one session, tears streaming down his face. When things got hard, I chose the bottle instead of fighting. I chose to disappear instead of facing my family. Other residents shared their stories. A former lawyer who'd embezzled client funds to support a gambling addiction, a surgeon who'd lost her license over prescription drug abuse, a teacher who'd destroyed his career through alcoholism. Thomas realized his story wasn't unique, that addiction was a great equalizer that cared nothing for education or success or intentions. But he also learned something crucial. Recovery was possible. The lawyer was rebuilding her practice doing pro bono work. The surgeon was teaching at a medical school. The teacher was writing a book about recovery. They'd all fallen. They'd all gotten back up. As weeks turned into months, Thomas began to change. Physically, his body healed, his color returned, his hands steadied, his mind cleared. Emotionally, he started to forgive himself, to understand that mistakes didn't define him permanently, that he could be more than his worst moments. Victoria visited once a month, always bringing updates on the Stone Foundation Pathways program that was being built. We're breaking ground on the first facility next month, she told him during a November visit. 300 beds, full services job training center, everything you suggested. Thomas had been working with the planning team remotely, using his street knowledge to shape the program. The hardest moment came in December, 3 months into his treatment, when Dr. Okonkwo suggested he call his son. Thomas had avoided it, terrified of rejection, of hearing Daniel's voice and knowing how much he'd missed, how much he'd lost. What if he hates me? Thomas asked. The doctor smiled gently. What if he doesn't? What if he's been waiting for you to reach out, to show him you're trying? So Thomas made the call, his hands shaking as he dialed the number he still knew by heart. When Daniel answered, Thomas almost hung up, the old habit dying hard. Instead, he whispered, Daniel? It's Dad. The conversation was awkward, painful, filled with long silences and words that couldn't quite express years of absence. But Daniel didn't hang up. He listened as Thomas explained where he'd been, what had happened, what he was trying to do now. I'm in rehab, son. I'm getting clean. I'm trying to become someone you might not be ashamed of. Daniel's voice was thick when he replied, Dad, I was never ashamed of you.
I was worried about you.
I thought you were dead. They talked for 2 hours, beginning to bridge a 3-year silence. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start, a fragile connection that might grow into something stronger. As Thomas hung up, he realized Victoria had given him more than a job or a second chance. She'd given him a reason to become himself again. 6 months after that morning in the cathedral, the Stone Foundation Pathways facility opened its doors in the South Bronx. The converted warehouse now housed state-of-the-art facilities, individual sleeping quarters instead of crowded shelter bunks, medical and dental clinics, computer labs, classrooms, a commercial kitchen for culinary training, and workshops for construction and electrical work. But what made it different from other homeless services was Thomas McCarthy's influence throughout the design. There were secure lockers where residents could store possessions without fear of theft, private showers with actual doors, a quiet room for people overwhelmed by communal living. Small dignities that Thomas remembered craving during his years on the streets. The opening ceremony drew media attention and political figures, but Thomas found himself more interested in the first residents arriving, 50 men and women who'd been living on the streets, chosen through a lottery system that Thomas had insisted upon to avoid favoritism. He greeted each one personally, shaking hands, learning names, seeing in their eyes the same mixture of hope and suspicion he'd felt 6 months earlier. "This isn't charity," he told them during the first group meeting. "This is opportunity. We're going to help you rebuild your lives, but you have to do the work. I know because I've been there. 6 months ago, I was sleeping under an awning and drinking myself to death." Victoria attended the opening. Her first major public appearance since her near-death experience had become international news. She'd given interviews about the medical error, about being buried alive, about the homeless man who saved her life. But today's speech was different. "We live in a society that treats failure as permanent," she told the gathered crowd. "That assumes if someone falls down, they'll never get back up. That writes off entire categories of people as lost causes." She gestured to Thomas, standing beside her. "Thomas McCarthy taught me that we're all one crisis away from losing everything. That the difference between success and homelessness isn't character or worth. It's often just luck, timing, and whether someone gives you a second chance." Over the following months, Thomas threw himself into his work with an intensity that surprised everyone, including himself. He spent his days at the facility, working with residents, troubleshooting problems, learning the administrative side of running a program. He spent his evenings in continuing outreach meetings and therapy, maintaining his sobriety with the same determination he'd once applied to drinking. And he spent his weekends slowly rebuilding his relationship with Daniel, who had started visiting from Florida, cautiously optimistic that his father might truly be back from the abyss. The program's success exceeded even Victoria's expectations. 70% of the first cohort found stable housing and employment within 6 months. Former residents started businesses, reunited with families, enrolled in college, rebuilt lives they'd thought were over forever. Thomas became a minor celebrity in social services circles, giving talks about designing programs with dignity, about seeing homeless people as individuals rather than statistics. But he never forgot where he'd come from. He kept a photo on his desk, a security camera image from the cathedral, frozen at the moment he'd started running down the aisle. It reminded him that everything in life could change in an instant, that miracles were possible, and that sometimes saving someone else's life was the key to saving your own. 1 year after Victoria's near burial, she organized a private dinner at her penthouse, not a corporate event or charity gala, but a simple gathering of the people who'd been part of her second life. Thomas arrived wearing a suit that actually fit, his hair cut professionally, his face showing the healthy flush of someone who'd been sober for a year. Daniel accompanied him, their relationship still healing but growing stronger. Dr. Rodriguez was there, along with Marcus, who'd become one of Thomas's strongest supporters at the company, his initial skepticism transformed into genuine respect. Victoria raised her glass. "A year ago I died," she said simply. "Or at least everyone thought I did. I experienced a kind of hell that I wouldn't wish on anyone, conscious but trapped, aware but helpless, unable to make anyone understand I was still here." She looked around the table. "But that experience taught me something crucial. It taught me that life isn't about accumulating wealth or power. It's about the moments we choose to see each other, to help each other, to recognize our shared humanity even when it's difficult or inconvenient." Her eyes found Thomas. "You saw me when I was invisible. You helped me when no one else could. And in doing so, you reminded me what really matters." Thomas stood, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. "Mrs. Stone, Victoria, you gave me something more valuable than money or a job. You gave me back my purpose, my dignity, my reason to be clean and sober. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. He glanced at Daniel, his voice catching. You helped me become the father I should have been all along. The Stone Foundation has helped over 200 people in the past year, but the first person it saved was me. He raised his own glass. To second chances. To seeing people who are invisible. To the courage to act when it matters, even when it's terrifying. The conversation flowed through the evening, laughter mixing with serious discussions about expanding the program to other cities, about the systemic changes needed to address homelessness, about the fine line between helping and enabling. Marcus talked about how working with Thomas had changed his perspective on leadership, on what truly made someone valuable to an organization. Dr. Rodriguez shared her own renewed commitment to thorough patient care, to never assuming, to always checking one more time. They'd all been changed by that day in the cathedral when death and life had balanced on a knife's edge. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Victoria pulled Thomas aside. I want to show you something, she said, leading him to her study. On the wall hung a painting, the cathedral interior, captured in dramatic oils, with Thomas frozen mid-run down the aisle, his arm outstretched, his face contorted with desperate certainty. I commissioned this to remind me, Victoria said softly. To remind me that heroes don't always wear suits or carry credentials. Sometimes they're broken people who find the courage to act when it matters most. Sometimes they're invisible until the moment we need them most. She turned to Thomas. You saved my life that day, but you've saved so many more since then. I want you to know that. Thomas stared at the painting, seeing himself as Victoria saw him, not as a homeless drunk, not as a failure, but as someone who'd mattered at a crucial moment, someone whose life had purpose and meaning. He thought about the long fall from business owner to street dweller, about the years of drinking and despair, about the morning he'd felt an inexplicable pull toward a cathedral he'd never entered before. He thought about all the small choices that had led to that moment, all the pain that had brought him to exactly where he needed to be. We saved each other, he finally said. You were trapped in death. I was trapped in a life that wasn't really living. We both needed someone to see us, to refuse to give up on us. He smiled. I guess that makes us even. Victoria laughed. I suppose it does. Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered in the darkness. Millions of lives intersecting and diverging, invisible threads connecting strangers who didn't yet know how their stories would intertwine. Somewhere in those streets, someone was falling. Somewhere, someone was rising. And somewhere, Thomas knew, someone else was about to become invisible, needing nothing more than for one person to see them, to refuse to look away, to risk everything for the chance to save a life. Maybe someone else's, maybe their own.